do in my research group with my staff and students. And when I was listening to Maya's talk, I came up with a new analogy of gravity for the biologists in the room. So gravity is like the virus of physics. We all know it's there, but it's really, really hard to measure. And what we use in my lab predominantly to look for variations in gravity is a NASA and German satellite mission that was launched in 2002. And really, it's unlike the satellites that Frank was talking about earlier. It doesn't actually take pictures of the ocean. It doesn't measure radiation of the ocean. All it does is it orbits around the Earth, and we measure how far the satellites are moving back and forth. And that gives us the information on gravity, because those orbits are controlled by the forces that act on them, and gravity, the Earth's gravity, is one of the strongest forces. Of course, if we just had GPS measurements on these two satellites, that's not nearly accurate enough to determine the minute changes in gravity that are causing these orbits to vary as they go over one place and another. So we actually have to, we use a microwave ranging system between these two satellites. These satellites fly about 250 kilometers apart. So that's about the distance between here and Orlando. And they measure the distance between them at a level of about 5 microns. So that's like the thickness of a human hair. So think about measuring between here and Orlando to an accuracy of 5 microns. That's pretty amazing. We're actually working on a new system right now that uses a laser that's going to be on the order of, an order of magnitude even better than that. So hopefully that'll go up in the next few years or so. But the way this works is, so Jackie came up with this analogy last year, and I loved it. So I'm gonna steal her analogies. Think about a roller coaster. So you've got two cars that are not connected to each other, and you're at the top of the roller coaster, and the first car starts down, and it's going to accelerate faster than the car coming up above, so they're going to move apart. Okay? Now, what happens when they come back the next time around? Okay? If nothing has changed in the gravity there, then they should move apart the same amount. But let's say that some huge gravity signal has appeared there. So in reality, it's going to be a big pool of water or something like that. But if you can't really imagine that water could cause that gravitational signal, think about a tiny black hole. Let's say it's, huge mass. Well, that first car is going to accelerate a little bit faster the second time around. Okay? And those are the types of measurements that we use to infer how gravity is moving around. So you may think that gravity doesn't change a whole lot from time to time, but it does. It's small, but it is measurable using this technique. So what can we actually do with gravity? Well, one of the things we can do with gravity is measure the pressure at the ocean floor. Basically, mass moving in the ocean is going to cause a pressure signal on the ocean floor, and that causes a gravitational signal. One of the problems that we've had over the last decade of using GRACE is the signal-to-noise ratio has been very, very low over the ocean. In fact, some of the earliest measurements of trying to characterize the noise in the GRACE measurement was to just simply look at the variability of it over the ocean and say, okay, this is noise. And I've spent the last 10 years trying to convince people that no, it's not noise. There is actually signal in there, and I've done a pretty good job of it. But over the last 2 years, there's been a fairly dramatic improvement in our understanding of some of the contributions to the noise of the GRACE measurement. The satellite teams have gone back and completely reprocessed the data, and so now we can actually see an improvement of almost about 50% in the noise reduction over the ocean. So now we can start to see variations of the ocean mass equivalent to about 1 centimeter of sea level or less. And that's actually a reasonable signal, so we can start to see things with it. So what can we study with GRACE? This is not all that we can study with GRACE, but this is primarily what we study in my lab. So one of them is sea level rise. There's a very large component of sea level rise that is due to the ocean getting heavier. Basically, putting fresh water in from the ice sheets causes more water to be stored in the ocean. It's not being evaporated out fast enough through precipitation to go into the water land, and so sea level is actually rising and the ocean is getting heavier, and we can measure that from GRACE. We can actually measure the specific contribution to that sea level rise from the ice sheets by actually weighing the ice sheets using this technique. But we can also see variations in ocean circulation and also effects on the Earth's rotation from the gravitational movements. And so these last two topics are really getting into some interesting aspects of ocean dynamics, where this satellite data can give us some very interesting insights that are hard to detect from other instruments. So I'll start with sea level rise, because a lot of people are interested in sea level rise, and there's been a lot of work with GRACE on sea level rise. And basically, because we can average over the very large area of the oceans, we can beat down that noise quite a bit. Okay? And it's a fairly dramatic signal. So the blue curve is our measurement of sea level from satellite altimeters that measure the sea surface height over time. And we've had those in place since the early 1990s. This is the black curve here is GRACE, starting in about 2003. And then the red curve is our best global estimate of the upper ocean heat content from autonomous drifters, the Argo program. We have scattered measurements back here, but they're very all over the ocean. They're not really in the Southern Ocean. And we're having some problems linking these two time series together. But the one thing you can see right away is that the heat content is not varying that much. It's fairly steady. There is a small seasonal cycle that's been removed, but interannual fluctuations are pretty low. The trend, it is warming, but it's not contributing only about 30% to global sea level rise. But over this time period, about 70% of the global observed sea level rise is due to the ocean getting heavier, basically more mass being added to the ocean from fresh water. Also, you can see that most of these large interannual excursions in sea level are related to mass. They're not due to the ocean heating. This one that you probably see right here happened in 2011. There's a paper that was just published in GRL by John Fasulu and a few others that actually explains what caused this. And it's actually very fascinating, and I encourage you to go read that paper. Basically, in 2011, there was a huge flooding event in 2010 in Australia. You probably saw it in the news. In the middle of the continent is basically desert, and it just stored that water. And it did not run off for like 6 or 7 months. There was a huge inland sea that developed in the middle of Australia, about, that thick, but over the entire interior of Australia. And that kept that water from going into sea level, and that caused that dip in sea level. It's fascinating. But let's look at the contribution of Antarctica and Greenland to the ocean variability, and leave in this seasonal signal that I took out in the previous graph. And the one thing you can see right away is this huge seasonal cycling of mass in the ocean. It goes up and it goes down. You can see the trend, which is related to the melting of the ice sheets from Greenland and Antarctica, but there's not much of a seasonal variation in them at all. This is the water cycle. This is water precipitating over land, being stored there temporarily, comes out of the ocean. That's where 90% of the water that's precipitated over land comes from, is out of the oceans. There's a stored there temporarily, then it runs off later, goes back into the ocean, and so we have this large seasonal cycling of water. But you can also see large interannual excursions. For example, it's a little bit lower here, a little bit lower here, not as low there. And so if you take out that mean seasonal variation and leave on the Antarctic contribution, again, the trends are about the same within the error bars. They're identical. But you see these large excursions of the sea level, and that's entirely due to water cycling between the oceans and land, being stored some places on land, taken out of the water, being stored, not precipitating over land as much. And so there's a lot of information in the sea level measurement and in the satellite gravity measurements of the water cycle and how the water cycle is changing in time. And so I'm working with several hydrologists in California to try to break out some information here about how the water cycle is changing in time and its contribution to sea level rise. But like I said, we can actually measure the gravity over the ice sheets as well and see how much mass the ice sheets are losing. And over the past few years, my research associate, Jenny Bonin, and I have been working on trying to get smaller scale measurements of GRACE over individual drainage basins of the ice sheets. And so we can actually start to see how one region is behaving relative to another region. So this is some work that we published earlier in this year. These colors here, why is it shaking? Someone walking above, I guess.
It's outside.
These colors, I've kind of blocked off the color bar here, but basically this is in meters of pure water that have been lost. And so all of these values are negative except for a small amount in the interior of the ice sheet, which is growing a little bit. And there's other evidence for that as well. But really look at the time series here. I've just picked off a few from these regions. So 5 is this one right here. 7 is this one here on the southeast coast. 8, there's a big drainage glacier. This is the biggest glacier in all of Greenland that drains out of this basin. And then 1. So until about 2003, 2004, this region up here was not actually losing mass at all. And you can see that here in the red, it's fairly steady, and then it's dropped off quite a bit. In fact, it's actually losing more mass now than this region 7, which has been losing mass for a long period of time. That's just from the extra warming that's been going over there, and now it's starting to lose mass from the glaciers. And of course, you can see 8, how fast it's draining. And you can actually visually see some of the acceleration that's happened over the last decade in the Greenland ice sheet. And so these units are in terms of cubic kilometers of water. So it's a huge amount of water. It's 300 cubic kilometers. Cubic kilometer, that's 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer high. 300 of those. 360 of those is equal to 1 millimeter of sea level rise, right? All right, so let's get into some ocean dynamics. Talked about sea level for a bit. So let's look at the way that we can use the gravity measurements to probe some aspects of ocean circulation. So this goes back to a theoretical paper that Carl Wunsch and Geodesist Kapashkin wrote back in 1980, where they looked at the traditional way to measure the geostrophic circulation by taking temperature and salinity, density, integrating it up from some pressure level, and taking the gradient of that to get the geostrophic shear and the geostrophic current. The problem with that method is that at some level, you have to assume that there is no geostrophic shear, okay, that there is no current at depth. Well, in a lot of regions of the ocean, that's a pretty good assumption. In the tropics, if you go down to 1,000 decibars or 2,000 decibars, you're pretty safe that there's not a lot of geostrophic shear. One of the problems where that doesn't work is in the Southern Ocean. The Antarctic circumpolar current has measurable currents all the way to the bottom floor. And in fact, sometimes they can be 20 or 30 centimeters per second. Well, they proposed that if we actually had a geoid, the static gravity field expressed as a surface, and we measured the sea surface height from an altimeter, and we difference those two, this is essentially an equipotential surface. And so the gradient of this dynamic topography, we don't need to worry about this reference velocity because since this is an equipotential surface, there is no shear across that. It's gravitationally, there is no geostrophic shear. And so we could get the surface current directly from this relationship. And a lot of people have done this now with geoid gradients. But one thing that has been missed and that they pointed out in this paper is that if we have this relationship and we have this measurement, we can combine these two and we can back out what the current is at depth if we don't know what it is. And so that's what my student Mike Kasimpa has been working on. for his PhD dissertation, and this is some of our first test validation of that. Right now, we actually have all the measurements that we need in order to do this. We have the gravity measurements from GRACE, we have satellite altimetry that's been around since the 1990s, and now we have these temperature and salinity profiles from the Argo program. We also have some estimates of the current at 1,000 decibars based on the drift of the Argo floats, so we can actually compare these two measurements. And qualitatively, they look very similar. You see the currents in the same location in both fields. They have about the same magnitude. If you do the standard deviation of these two maps, you get about 5 centimeters per second standard deviation differences. And that's exactly what the authors of this data set say. That's only as good as they trust this drift estimate from the Argo float, because there's a lot of problems with doing that, because you're assuming that when the Argo comes up, it takes about 10 hours for it to come up, that it hasn't moved, and that it hasn't been distorted by an eddy or anything like that. And so this top actually shows the effect of these eddies. You can actually see the effect of these eddies in the averaging. So the red curve is basically the max value of the current at any location here for each longitude. And so it should technically be somewhere in the ACC. That's where the max value of the velocity should be. And then the blue curve here is the value that we get from the bottom curve. That's from the drift velocity. And you can see that it varies all over the place. You get these huge excursions in the maximum velocity that it's not related to the background mean flow. It's related to mesoscale eddies. You can also do a time series from this method. And here we've taken the average over this area here and this area here, where we generally have the highest mean flow. And you can actually see these eddy contamination and the drift velocities. You can also see the problem is that there's lots of times where they actually can't fix a drift estimate. So now we can actually estimate the current at depth, not only at 1,000 decibars, but for any pressure level even below 1,000 decibars, because the Argo floats go down to 2,000 decibars before they start making their ascent. And we can start to map the currents at every depth, and from that we can estimate the transport of the ACC across any transect over time, at least above 2,000 decibars. And so this is a plot of that at just two locations. The red one is just south of Africa, and the blue one is just south of Tasmania. The red one is very noisy, mainly because of contamination of eddies through the Agulhas return flow. The conclusion of the paper that we're working on is that this technique's not really going to work very well there, because there's just so much energetic eddies there that's contaminating the problem. But for Tasmania, it's actually fairly clean. The mean value that has been measured from hydrographic sections is about 140 spheredrops. And that's about what we're seeing as well. But we're also able to see the time resolution of that as well, which is almost impossible to measure through hydrographic sections, that it can only go out in the summer months down there and maybe go out every 3 or 4 years.
Hey Don, my eyeball sees what might be a trend.
There may be a small trend, but if you look at the internal variability, it's not significant. It's, if you look at the internal variability, it's not. There are known to be low-frequency variations in the transport related to the winds there, and so that's part of what you're seeing. We can also look at the transport directly from the GRACE measurements themselves. So that was using a combination of the mean gravity from GRACE and the altimetry and the in-situ temperature salinity measurements. This is just looking at the time variable gravity from GRACE and the bottom pressure. So we can get another aspect of the transport of the ACC by looking at the bottom pressure variations north and south of the current. Okay? So what the current, the ACC is in geostrophic balance by having high pressure to the north and low pressure to the south. If this pressure to the north increases and the pressure to the south decreases, you're going to have an increase in the transport to balance that. And if it's vice versa, then you're going to have a decrease in the balance. And so we can actually measure these variations in the bottom pressure from Grace, north and south of the ACC, and infer what the transport is varying. It's not the exact same transport from this previous slide. This is more the depth averaged transport of the ACC. And we actually cannot get the mean transport of the ACC, only the variable component of the transport. And so this is work that Jessica Mikowski has been working on. She'll be defending her thesis this semester. So you'll be seeing a lot more results of that in her thesis. So if you're interested in that, make sure you come to that talk. But here's an example of, again, this south of Australia. We did a little bit of averaging to beat down some of the noise. But the red curve is our estimate, along with some uncertainty analysis, of the monthly transport of the ACC south of Australia. And then the blue is a low-pass filter of that. We've removed the seasonal cycle, and we've low-pass filtered it. And so you can see excursions of plus or minus 10 sverdrups. That's about right from what previous studies have found. And you can also see this very low-frequency signal associated with it. Now, one thing is that I know what Bob is looking at is that this is a little bit different in terms of the trend than what we saw in the previous slide. But the other thing in the previous slide, that was only above 2,000 decibars. And this is for the full water column. And so there may be something going on below 2,000 decibars that we can combine these two techniques to understand why these are varying a little bit differently. Another thing that Jessica is looking at is the relationship with winds. And this is just a correlation plot of the transport that we measure right through here with the zonal winds from scatterometers. And this correlation here, and this is the subtropical front, which is kind of the northern boundary of the ACC. It's really not a good northern boundary in the Pacific, but it is a good northern boundary here in the Indian Ocean. This correlation here on the southern side has been fairly well known for a long time. This positive correlation, this is the southern annular mode, and it's known to drive the variability of the ACC. But these negative correlations here are really driving, it's a wind stress curl that's driving the subtropical front, the transport along the subtropical front. And so what Jess is finding now is that that has an aspect to the interannual variability as well. It's not just the zonally averaged wind stress that's driving the transport, but also a small component of the wind stress curl right here that's driving through the subtropical front as well. All right, so on a completely different topic, let's talk about Earth rotation. But before we talk about Earth rotation, let's talk about large amounts of mass being moved around in the oceans. So what I've done here, and this follows from a paper that I did with Josh Willis a few years ago, right when I got here to USF, is we looked at bottom pressure from Grace averaged over the Pacific. So we averaged the entire mass of the Pacific and saw how it varied in time, and then we correlated it with every other local bottom pressure signal. And what we found was that there's this large area of correlation of bottom pressure in the Pacific that was anti-correlated with the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. All right? And previous studies had actually looked at the annual fluctuation in this, and we knew that there was kind of an annual exchange of mass between the Atlantic and the Pacific, basically here through the Drake Passage. But we showed that there was an interannual exchange of mass as well. Here's kind of a time series to show that. So here, you can see it very well here. So as the mass of the Pacific rises, it falls in the Atlantic and also in the Indian Ocean. The Atlantic and Indian Ocean are actually highly correlated, and the Pacific is anti-correlated with both of them. So basically, as the Pacific is gaining mass, the Atlantic is losing mass. And it's a very small transport difference which explains this. It's about 1/100th of a sverdrup. I mean, it's just a tiny imbalance between the amount of transport that goes into the Pacific and leaves through the Indonesian through flow and Drake Passage. It's actually almost impossible to measure through just a transect of transport. But the one thing that I've thought about is what's driving that. And I find that there's a relationship between the winds in the Indian Ocean driving this. So it's probably through the subtropical front is changing this transport variations. But the other thing I've been thinking about for a while is what would this effect have on the Earth rotation? And so you may be a little bit familiar with the rotating Earth, and some of you may know that it wobbles a bit over periods of time. You have your precession, you have your nutation. These are really driven by the solar and lunar tides and the orientation of the Earth with the sun and the moon. But there's also much smaller fluctuations in the Earth's polar position that are driven by mass movements on the Earth itself. And so one of the things I've been wondering about for several years since we discovered this fluctuation of mass between the Pacific and Atlantic was, would it have a measurable effect on Earth rotation, and how large would that be? And so this is some work that Sarah Kwan, my other student, is working on. And we've actually known for some time that mass variations in the ocean cause the Earth rotation to vary. But no one has actually looked at where the mass is moving or where it's varying that's causing these Earth rotations. So that's kind of the new thing that we've done. And so what we wanted to quantify was whether this large-scale exchange of mass between the Pacific and Atlantic was driving any of the Earth rotation that's observed, or is it mainly related to redistribution of mass within the ocean, like large local wind effects pumping mass into one area or taking it out of another area. And so we're using completely a model for this, and these are just some really preliminary results. But it looks like, if we look at the bottom pressure from the model and convert it into these Earth rotation parameters, the chi1 and chi2 excitation functions, this basin averaged fluctuation of mass from between the Atlantic and the Pacific actually has no signal in the chi1 excitation function, but it explains about 60%, 50 to 60% of the chi2 excitation function. So basically, this mass moving between the Pacific and Atlantic on these seasonal and interannual time periods is explained about half of the excitation of the polar motion for this one function. And then the redistribution just within the Pacific, not the Atlantic, not the Indian Ocean, just the redistribution within the Pacific is causing almost all the remaining excitation in the chi1 and the residual in the chi2. So anyway, preliminary results. Ran a little bit late. So in conclusion, I just want to hope that I've convinced you that satellite gravity measurements are really cool. I've already convinced another hardcore physical oceanographer, Greg Johnson, that they are, and he got all excited about it, and we published a paper recently. And you know, there are several benefits to it. It's really the only direct way to weigh the sea level for the ocean mass component and also the ice sheets. Previously, before GRACE, we used all kinds of inferences of other data sets to see what these things were doing for their contribution to sea level. And some of those were right, some of those were wrong. But now we actually have a direct independent measurement of it. It's really cool now that we can actually start to combine the gravity measurements with altimetry and these in situ temperature salinity measurements, and not only get the geostrophic currents at the surface, but also at depth as well. And that's something that we're really excited about and looking at too in our lab. Finally, using it to measure this transport through the Southern Ocean. Measuring transport across the Southern Ocean, and especially how it varies in time, is a very, very difficult measurement to make. These will never be as accurate as doing it with lowered ADCPs or hydrographic sections. We'll never probably be able to see the exact frontal structure of the ACC, but we make up for that by being able to do this every month. And that gives us it will contribute to our understanding of the transport of the Southern Ocean. And then finally, it's helpful for understanding how these small mass transports over large areas driven by the winds in the ocean can be leading to large changes in Earth rotation. And so one of the more interesting things that's coming out of this study is that the winds over just the Indian Ocean seem to be explaining nearly 50% of the Chandler wobble. That's what some of the initial things that we're getting out of this seems to imply. And that's interesting because people have been looking about for years what is the source of the excitation of the Chandler wobble. And some of our preliminary results suggest that it may be the winds over the Indian Ocean. And now we need to know why they're varying at that periodicity so that they are actually driving the Chandler wobble.